Greetings, my dear audience, and warmest welcome to the Impact webinar, Sailing to the Future, Cultivating Resilient and Sustainable Supply Chains in Australia's Wind Energy Development. My name is Kayla, Content Analyst at Leader Associates, and it's my great honor to be a host for today's webinar. Wind power lies at the core of Australia's energy future, serving as the cornerstone in the nation's pursuit of renewable energy. Unlocking the full potential of Australia's wind energy requires a resilient and cost-effective supply chain tailored to its unique geography and energy demands. Collaboration among governments, industry stakeholders, and global partners is essential to cultivate a supply chain ecosystem capable of meeting the evolving needs of wind projects. During today's webinar, we will explore fortifying Australia's wind supply chains with participation from industry stakeholders, SLR Consulting, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Scottish Development International, Latrobe Valley Authority, KIMAenergy, Director Infrastructure, and DLA Piper. Together, we will delve into strategies for integrating cross-sector capabilities and fostering innovation to prepare Australia to the forefront of the global wind energy landscape. I'm also encourage all of you to actively engage in our discussions and share your invaluable insights in our Q&A box. Meanwhile, I'm also excited to announce that today's virtual session is also part of our physical gathering, Australia Wind Energy 2024, scheduled from July 9th to 11th in Melbourne. Welcoming over 5,000 industry stakeholders is a prime opportunity to forge partnerships in Australia's booming wind sector. Early conferred speakers include representatives from the governments of Ireland, Norway, Denmark, and Australia, as well as Big Grid, Equinor, RWE, Iberdrola, and with many more to be announced. Without further ado, let's step into today's agenda. We will begin with an address on the unlocking wind energy potential, policy and regulatory frameworks for Australia, addressed by Ms. Astrid Ruban, Principal Consultant for Social Performance at SLR Consulting. Let's welcome.
Thank you, Kayla.
Hi, Astrid.
Hi. Are you ready for me to kick off?
Yeah.
All right. Bear with me, everybody, while I share my screen. As I was saying, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I'm sitting. I recognise their deep and enduring and living connection to land, sea and sky country, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I think it is really important as we talk about wind energy here in Australia that we consider the interplay of all elements of this land. So I extend my respects to the custodians of the lands on which we all sit and work, to their elders past and present, and to any First Nations people joining us today. I will run through a little bit of what my presentation will include, but first I'll just introduce myself. As Kayla mentioned, and as I mentioned before, I'm the Principal Consultant in SLR's newly established Social Performance team. We've been established partly in response to growing prominence of social and cultural licence in the success of major projects and to drive more mutually beneficial outcomes for projects and their communities. I specialise in risk-informed community and stakeholder engagement and social impact assessment. I'm currently working on wind farm proposals in WA, as well as a number of battery energy storage system projects across Australia. And for those of you who may be unfamiliar with SLR, we're a pure play sustainability firm with about 850 staff across Australia, including 550 technical specialists across all ranges of sustainability, and about 3,000 staff globally. So as you can see there on the screen, I've popped up a little agenda. Today we're talking about the regulatory and policy context of wind farms in Australia. So I'll take you through a little snapshot of where we are currently. We'll have a look at some of the challenges that present themselves and the opportunities or potentials that exist as well. There'll also be a little bit of time at the end to answer some questions. So please do continue to drop your questions into the chat, the Zoom chat there. So we'll jump straight into discussion of what's currently happening in Australia with respect to wind energy. So from the CEC 2023 report, we know that wind farms accounted for 36% of renewable energy generation in Australia, which accounts for 13% of total generation capacity. Victoria is the leader for wind generation, accounting for 34% of total capacity across Australia, followed by South Australia at 22% and New South Wales at 21%. As of 2023, there are 110 wind farms operating across Australian states and territories, including 31 wind farms that are over 15 years old. And that's of a typical lifespan of between 20 and 30 years. Although we see that the wind farms being developed now tend to have longer operating lifespans. The largest completed program as of this report was the Stockyard Hill Wind Farm in regional Victoria with 149 turbines, but we do know as well that there are many other projects now in construction or being proposed that are double this size or even larger. As of this time last year, a total of 19 wind projects were under construction or financially committed. And we are seeing as well a significant growth in proposals and development activities for offshore wind projects with a total project generation capacity of up to 50 gigawatts. So in Australia, we do have great wind and great potential wind energy resources, but some of that potential does need to be unlocked as it faces some policy and structural barriers. So let's have a look at the current context of energy or renewable policy in Australia. And as I mentioned, any questions at any stage or any comments, please do drop them in the chat as we go through. So the key driver for this transition to renewable energy is the federal government's target of net zero by 2050. So you can see here on this slide, we're looking at federal, state and local government, as well as technical and global drivers of change. So the government's target of net zero is supported by the emissions reduction targets, which set a goal for 80% renewable energy by 2035. And we're currently sitting, I think, about 38% or just under 40%. Australia is also a signatory to the Paris Agreement, so there's that global push. Other recent policy that is emerging at the federal level in particular is a capacity investment scheme, which is to encourage new investment in renewable capacity by providing revenue underwriting. This was expanded late last year, I think in November, to target a greater total capacity nationally. The Commonwealth Government is also preparing sectoral decarbonisation plans to address energy and electricity, industrial waste, resources, built environment, agriculture, land and transport. Within these, this is a broader view of the circular economy and how each of those elements can contribute to the renewables transmission. The ARENA, as I'm sure you're all aware of, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, was developed to support projects that advance renewable energy technologies, along with the innovations in the supply chain. And significantly in Victoria, particularly the first formally declared offshore wind farm zone off Gippsland was identified, and further to that, an identification of 5 more regions with great potential. So there are a variety of policies and drivers, and on top of these government directions, we've got industry groups and peak bodies that produce resources and research, rigorous guides to set benchmarks for best practice and advocate for policy. So, given that that's the context, what are the challenges? I have roughly categorized what I consider to be some core challenges into 4 different categories there. You'll see I've got policy, structural, social, and the unexpected. This is not a comprehensive or necessarily scientific categorization of these challenges, and some of them might fall across a couple of these categories. This is just one way of fitting things onto a slide. With respect to policy, what we've seen as a fairly prominent barrier to wind energy and renewables is the slow churn of the machinery of government. It, as we've all experienced, is slow to change and can lag behind market opportunity. I think connected to that is the need for strong, clear, bipartisan support for long-term sustainability and continuity of policy and programs. Renewables tends to be a space where it can get quite political, so I don't think we're quite there with that bipartisan support. We also see discrepancies between state and federal policy, and also differences between each state and territory for requirements, approvals, processes, priorities. And a lot of this can hinder timely project approvals. I'll run through an example of this in the next slide. Navigating local content requirements is also particularly a barrier, obviously, when you're looking at overseas investors trying to establish themselves in our domestic market, particularly as we don't necessarily have the labour market to support a lot of that demand in-house, as it were. Structural barriers include the need for transmission infrastructure to connect up and maximise the benefit and realise the potential of each of these developments and actually deliver those benefits. The transmission infrastructure is a separate component. It faces arduous approvals processes and its own cost as well. Our domestic demand is also highly reliant on the global supply chain. So we are far away and we're big. So we need a lot of infrastructure to support these developments, and it has to travel a long way to get to us. This issue is not necessarily unique to Australia. We've seen it in the Seagreen offshore wind farm in the North Sea as well. And it generally, it occurs where the local industry is not big enough to support manufacturing for the infrastructure required for these developments. There's also the perennial problem of vessel availability to ship components to remote places like Australia. And particularly in Australia, the lack of suitable port access and transport for components has been a barrier that we've seen emerge in recent years. The embodied energy arising from those multiple heavy load trips throughout the supply chain as well is also a consideration when we're looking at the transition to renewable and the overall benefits and how they stack up. We've also got there the clarity about decommissioning and disposal of components of wind energy as projects reach the end of their lifespan. While the components are recyclable, there is particularly a lot of community concern around how that decommissioning will be managed and how elements will be disposed of. The social challenges that we face, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So we've got community uncertainty. Any transition process is a big change, and that can be of concern to communities at a regional level and also at a local level where they're really experiencing those impacts. Cost of living is front of mind for all communities at the moment, and the transition to renewables is costly upfront. And the benefits to households are not immediately evident. So this can be a platform for some community opposition and demonstrate the need for a bit of education about long-term benefits. Economic consequences, again, that job loss and impact on households against the broader long-term benefits may not be immediately evident to some people. We also can't disregard the unexpected challenges that can emerge. Global events, as we have seen very recently through COVID and extreme climate events, can disrupt supply chains, can derail projects through cost, timing, program disruptions, and particularly when you're so reliant on that global supply chain, it can amplify the risks of these unexpected and global events. Apologies if you can hear my cat in the background. She's just decided to join us. So as an example of, there we go, a very recent example of some of these challenges and being evidenced, ABC News ran a report just on the 29th of February, so last week, about the example of regulatory delays and the impact on wind farm developments. This report found that only 3 wind farms were connected to the power grid last year, and that regulatory approvals process was, particularly in New South Wales, was the key barrier to a lot of new development. So you can see there, according to industry insiders, the time it's taking to get approval for large-scale wind and solar projects is the biggest bottleneck in this once-in-a-century transmission, particularly in New South Wales. You can see there that approval timeframes in New South Wales can blow out to 9.5 years for some wind projects, with solar and battery not facing quite as many hold-ups, I suppose. The report also recognises the Infrastructure and Energy Commissioner report that was released earlier this year that does acknowledge that developers are creating mistrust within communities towards the renewable rollout and developments, and that this community outrage is also a barrier to approvals and timely processing. So given some of the challenges that we've just looked at, what are the potentials to address some of these challenges and improve efficiency and streamline the regulatory and approval process in Australia? Well, as a headline, the more permitted projects we have in place increases market stability and certainty for supply chain growth. We are able to learn from experience and impart that knowledge into supply chain issues, approvals processes, and all of the other infrastructure and structural aspects surrounding these developments. This also applies to the supporting investigations that need to be undertaken. Once it's done, you've got not so much a prototype or a template, but you have a pathway. And so it's leaning on that information to guide a more streamlined approach. We can also look further afield, and I think as consultants, that is what we do. We look for examples of success. We can look, for example, to the UK for examples of proactive bipartisan governance, where support for renewable energy or wind energy was established quite early on, and now wind power is the UK's largest source of electricity, providing over 32% of the country's electricity. Looking further afield, we can also look to where manufacturing hubs and industry is more established. In Australia, that makes sense for us to look towards Japan and Korea for opportunities to streamline the rollout and potential collaboration opportunities for a more regionally based supply chain. That could also include looking at opportunities to collaborate with our neighbours in New Zealand to enhance regional uptake and coordinate the supply chain and build efficiencies. I think establishing a holistic policy approach as well is critical to producing more policy support for this transition. So with a focus on the overarching benefits of environment, economy, jobs, community health and inclusion that can be delivered through transition, we have a number of different policy pathways that combined can provide additional support. We can consider how wind energy can assist in a just transition by considering diverse policy pathways and education opportunities is what I've written there. An example of that you'll see in that graph below. It illustrates the possible employment outcomes for investment scenarios for offshore wind development. So in Australia, there are about 5,000 jobs in coal-fired power and a further 40 to 50,000 jobs in coal mining more broadly. There's also another 20 to 25,000 jobs in oil and gas. So workforce and community transition programs are required to support a fair and smooth transition. And these programs, in doing that, also support a greater uptake in the development opportunities for renewable energy and wind. Further potential for policy support takes into account opportunities for better engagement with First Nations peoples. The First Nations Clean Energy Network is driving greater First Nations engagement in major projects in an effort to contribute to self-determination and encourage ways to plan, design, own and operate community to large-scale power projects on country in ways that support inclusion and participation of our communities and people. The First Nations Clean Energy Network is an Australian group that has been modelled after the Canadian equivalent, the Indigenous Clean Energy. This group draws on those Canadian examples, which demonstrate that First Nations participation in energy partnerships was found to reduce delays, reduce costs across the project and risk, over the project lifecycle by increasing engagement, community buy-in, local employment, business development, and benefit sharing opportunities. It also assisted to realise the positive impacts on land of social licence and energy security and achieving sustainable energy projects. So you can find out more about the Indigenous Clean Energy Group, which are a fascinating and really impressive group driving better outcomes for First Nations peoples. And you can also, I would recommend listening to their Decolonising Power podcast that you can find out more about on their website. Finally, with respect to the potential opportunities for growth, improvement, streamlining our regulatory framework in Australia is an acknowledgement that the establishment phase is never easy. In a global context, we are still relatively, I don't want to say in our infancy, but we're still developing in this sector. So we're seeing, while we've progressed with onshore wind so far, we are seeing similar growing pains for the offshore wind sector and the green hydrogen economy. So getting these sectors going will continue to influence cost, stretch and grow supply chains and test delivery schedules until, like I said at the outset, we've got that experience and that practice to be able to make more informed, intentional decisions and streamline those processes a little bit more. Collective strategic planning will also help across the board to comprehensively smooth that process. So with that, that is the end of the guts of my presentation. And I'm keen for any questions that you have in relation to that. I see that there have been some questions posed through registration, so I can respond to them now while you think of any further questions if you've got any. So someone has asked, oh, sorry, Kayla, go on.
Hi, Ms. Astrid. Many thanks for your presentation. And actually, due to the tight schedule, maybe we can pick one question from our Q&A box. And the question from Mr. Harry, his question is, in the UK, onshore wind development particularly has faced a considerable public opposition, and this led to the Conservative Party placing an effective moratorium on the development of onshore wind farms in 2015. What challenges, if any, does Australian wind development face as a result of public and political opinion?
Yeah, that is an issue that is faced not only by the wind industry, but I think all major infrastructure developments. What we would typically do in that scenario, as I mentioned earlier, change is difficult. And any kind of transition, any introduction of new industry is always going to be challenging and can result in a lot of community uncertainty and community opposition. And that can very easily flow through to political opposition and escalate. So what I would propose, or what I'd really like to see to mitigate that risk as far as possible, is a broader public education program and more engagement with the issues and values of communities that are dealing with these projects. often we see a discrepancy between the communities that are facing the impacts and where the benefits will actually be distributed, at least in the immediate term. So I think a broader public education approach gives us the opportunity to share the problem and to share or buy into the solution to these problems that renewable energy presents. And in doing that, you're developing an acceptance of the outcome. Even if the process isn't necessarily a comfortable one for people, if you can build acceptance towards the overall outcome and demonstrate how long-term benefits will play out for the things that communities and people value and how it will filter down to the household level, I think that's the best avenue to address or mitigate opposition and outrage.
Thanks for your address. And actually, it's time to our next session. But there's still several questions in our Q&A box. Hope you are willing to address them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Then we will delve into the next key address. A pre-recorded session by Mr. Matt Schaus, Senior Offshore Wind Analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Now we will share the video with you.
Hi, my name is Matt Shields. I'm a Senior Wind Energy Analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and today I'll be talking about a supply chain roadmap for offshore wind energy in the United States. I'd first just like to say thanks for the opportunity to present at Australian Wind Energy 2024. We closely track all the activity happening in Australia and the Asia Pacific region. It's just been really exciting to see the progress and developments taking place in offshore wind in the area. I wanted to start with just a quick background about NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, just who we are and what we do. We are one of the 17 national labs that are funded by the Department of Energy. We're the only one that focuses exclusively on renewable and clean energy. We've got a few campuses throughout the US with most of our workforce based in Colorado. And really what we do is we kind of sit between federal funding and the research and development work that we do for the Department of Energy, as well as external partnerships with industry, federal and state governments, nonprofits, small businesses, really just kind of all over the map here. So one of the roles that we really try to play is bringing early stage technology and kind of fundamental and big picture research to industry and working closely between all these different players within the space. So we feel like we're in a good place to really help understand and move forward the conversation on things like supply chain for offshore wind energy. So the big takeaway of the talk and some of our recent reports in the area is that maximizing the economic benefits that you'd like to obtain through developing an offshore wind energy supply chain requires near-term planning and investment to build up these infrastructure and resources. And then if you can do so, not only do you create these economic benefits within your country, you also have the opportunity to actually increase your chances of meeting your offshore wind development goals. If we look at the US, the pipeline that we have in front of us could correspond to potentially 60 gigawatts or so installed by the mid-2030s, even though we're really only building the first 2 commercial scale projects as we speak right now. And that corresponds to about $300 billion of capital investment and could be 10 to 60,000 potential jobs. And again, that's really just another 15 or so years from now. That's a huge demand for components and vessels and workers, and the existing global supply chain just cannot meet that demand. So realistically, if we or if other countries want to meet these offshore wind targets that are being established, there needs to be a serious discussion and planning exercise to understand what pieces of that supply chain you can localize and how you can actually use that to achieve offshore wind goals. When we talk about developing a domestic supply chain, particularly in the next 5-10 years, within the context of some of the US's planning targets, there's several elements that we think are critical that have to be considered in the development process. First is just understanding what are the barriers and gaps and the solutions to overcoming these gaps, which would certainly vary from location to location, country to country, for instance. But some of the big ones that we go through in our report are consistent everywhere. For instance, you have to have a consistent pipeline of projects and demand for components to de-risk early stage investments in factories, vessels, ports, and some of the key infrastructure pieces that you need. You need manufacturing both at the major component level and also in the supporting supply chain, your tier 2 and tier 3 manufacturers. You need ports, you need vessels, you need workforce, and we feel it's also critical to include these energy justice considerations of how are you impacting local communities with these sort of investments, both positively and even potentially negatively. These all need to be considered at the planning stage as you start to develop what a supply chain needs to look like. So some of the results from our recent papers, we've looked at what's the demand for this pipeline of offshore wind projects in the US, and if you map out what the number of components and the technology evolution and the demand for vessels and ports and other enabling infrastructure, we estimate that developing a supply chain that would leave you at the ability to sort of sustainably install 4 to 6 gigawatts per year would take about $22 billion to invest of investment, and would take 6 to 9 years to build those resources. Even that number was published about a year ago, so given the sort of economic trends we've been seeing, that number's likely quite a bit higher than that now. But I think what's important to remember is that while this is obviously a huge investment and huge amount of resources needed to mobilize this supply chain, that level of deployment would correspond to hundreds of billions of dollars of capital going into the offshore wind projects. And again, much of that, the benefits of that investment can be recouped locally through jobs, lower cost electricity, other incentives that come out of the offshore wind projects themselves. So this is really an enabling investment to meet your offshore wind projects to get built, and in fact at a much higher level of capital investment than the supply chain. One of the particular areas we've taken some close look at is what the port and vessel infrastructure would need to look like in order to enable this type of development to take place. We looked at the pipeline on the east coast of the United States and put together some modeling capabilities that would simulate the installation of every project in that pipeline. On the left here, you can see if we just use the existing resources, the existing ports and the existing vessels that are available to us now, more than half of that pipeline would be at risk of being delayed beyond the 2030 targets that the federal government set for itself. However, if we invested more, and in fact significantly more, potentially $6 billion in ports and vessels along the East Coast, it would enable these planning targets to be achieved and potentially deploy 30 gigawatts by 2030. Certainly there are other bottlenecks and challenges to that target, but from an infrastructure, a port and vessel infrastructure perspective, that right level of investment could enable your planning targets to get met. And this was something we were able to do sort of semi-quantitatively with a model which is actually looking at the interaction between ports and vessels and the installation steps offshore. So again, it's a significant investment, but one that needs to be considered if you want to enable and achieve the deployment targets being set. We've also looked at work on the West Coast, and so this is floating wind for the U.S. Looking at what the port network would need to look like in order to enable different levels of deployment between 25 and 55 gigawatts by 2045 now on the West Coast. We found that this is probably $15 to $30 billion of port investment to build out that West Coast port infrastructure, and that's inclusive of manufacturing ports where you're actually building components, staging and integration ports where you're assembling things, you're mounting the turbine on the floating platform and towing the whole system out to sea, and then the operations and maintenance sites where you would be doing sort of the day-to-day maintenance and repair for the projects out at sea. Again, I think the same concept here that we talked about with the fixed bottom projects, $15 to $30 billion is a huge amount of money, but the level of investment in the actual projects that would enable is probably closer to 125 to 275 billion of investment, of capital investment in the project. So there's a real sort of force multiplier here of being able to make a significant upfront investment, but then to be able to enable more development and again, hopefully recoup more of those benefits back to the local states and local communities. When we talk about this this type of benefit that could come back to the local communities, I think one of the easiest ways to understand what that could be is thinking about the types of jobs and the number of jobs that could be created. When we looked at the fixed bottom pipeline in the U.S. primarily, or really the 2030 targets that we've set for ourselves, we model that this could require about 10,000 direct jobs in major manufacturing facilities to get this done, assuming that those manufacturers are in the U.S. making the big components, the blades, the foundations, the cables, would be about 10,000 direct jobs, which is a huge number of workers. But I think one of the interesting things that we identified was that there's an opportunity space for about 5 times as many jobs in the supporting supply chain. So the people that are making secondary steel, that are making paint, coatings, the supplemental materials that go into these type of tier 1 components. And in many cases, those are jobs that are within companies that already exist within the US. So if you can find a way to activate the supporting supply chain, there's an opportunity space for even more jobs and more work and more benefits to be created than what you see in sort of the flagship tier 1 manufacturing facilities. So it's a real opportunity for existing small and medium-sized businesses to become engaged within the supply chain. And in some of the reports we've done recently in the supply chain roadmap, we took a look through states throughout the U.S. and came up with some metrics and data that we could compare to just see, where are these skill sets that you would need to fill these supporting supplier jobs. And we really found that those skill sets are distributed throughout the U.S. It's not just in the states that are adjacent to the offshore wind activities that are taking place in the U.S. right now. So we saw relevant skill sets in the Great Lakes region, in the Gulf of Mexico, even some cases in the center of the country, where you might have experience in oil and gas manufacturing, aerospace, shipbuilding. There's just a lot of adjacent industries where the skill sets are transferable or useful for offshore wind activities. So this is somewhat borne out by what we're seeing with some of the announcements and ongoing activities in the supply chain. The map on the right shows manufacturing, port, and vessel investments that have been announced during the Biden administration, and you see that these span from the Northeast, where the actual offshore wind deployment is taking place, but also in the Great Lakes, the Gulf of Mexico, really throughout many places in the country. So this is sort of an indicator that finding a way to coordinate regionally could be a way to create a more efficient supply chain, because there are these tangible skill sets and existing capabilities that we could build off of without reinventing the wheel completely. That's not to say that's easy to do. In fact, it's extremely complex to do, but finding the way to build off of existing resources can be an advantageous way to stand up that supply chain. The same concept sort of exists on the West Coast, where we feel that regional collaboration amongst the West Coast states to develop these ports for floating wind could also benefit from coordination and collaboration at a regional level. Fundamentally, the challenge here is that whether the deployment levels on the West Coast are at the 25 or the 55 gigawatt level by 2045, which are 2 of the scenarios that we ran, it's unlikely that any individual state would have enough manufacturing port space to meet that demand, even again at the lower deployment levels. So if you want to localize as much of that supply chain as possible, you would need the different states to collaborate, understand what they're best at, understand what their role is, understand how the commodities and goods can really be traded between those different states. And that sort of collaboration and coordination would enable really more a stronger supply chain and more support for regional projects to be enacted. One last thing that's important to mention is that this type of development, building big manufacturing facilities, ports, shipbuilding, these have to go into these big coastal communities, typically ports, just because of the size and scale of offshore wind components. And typically port communities have historic vulnerabilities through diverse health, environmental, educational, economic, and other factors which have sort of ebbed and flowed with time as businesses or economic opportunities come in and out of particular port communities. So bringing in an industry like offshore wind has the opportunity to create significant benefits for these communities, but it could also be harmful if they're not given a sufficient voice or opportunity to frame the development in such a way that works for the community. So the example is, of course, you could be creating jobs with a new port or new manufacturing facility, but are those jobs accessible to the education levels and to the local community that's in that port community? So these plots here are an example of some of the work we did on the West Coast, looking at different prospective port communities, where on the left we look at sort of community vulnerability scores for a radius around some of these port communities, averaged over sort of the entire region. And we see that there are kind of low, medium, and high vulnerabilities that we have to look at. And in reality, we break this down a little bit further in the report. The source of these vulnerabilities is very different from location to location. So in some cases, you may have sort of environmental or health or sort of pollution-related vulnerabilities that might be in a more urban area. In more rural areas, you might have more education or transport barriers that might be a risk factor for creating benefits for communities in the region. And at the same time, the plot on the right, there's different levels of accessibility for these different regions. So again, when you talk about this opportunity for how to develop benefits for a community through offshore wind development, are you creating opportunities that can sort of meaningfully be achieved or obtained by that local community? So incorporating this type of consideration into the decisions at early stages of where supply chain facilities should be located is really important to the long-term sustainability and viability and I guess just nature of supply chain development. So I'll just wrap up with a few key takeaways. So first, a domestic supply chain would require tens of billions of dollars of investment, but could enable hundreds of billions of dollars of offshore wind projects to be built, and then the subsequent jobs and benefits to kind of flow back into these communities. In order to develop these supply chain assets, it's challenging but critical to de-risk these early stage investments. There's a lot of stakeholders involved with this, manufacturers, local communities, project developers, state and local governments, federal governments. But the more you can do to de-risk these projects by creating strong demand signals, creating transparency and predictability in the permitting and financing process, understanding how technology evolution, so the ever-increasing size of turbines, for example, the more you can stabilize those things and provide predictability into the market, the more you can de-risk these early investments. And then finally, integrating local communities into the decision-making process at the beginning, not imposing decisions on local communities, can not only enable these more just and equitable outcomes, but also strengthen the development of the supply chain itself. So with that, I'd just like to say thanks very much for the time and for the opportunity to present. I'll plan on distributing these slides. There's some links to some recent publications in here, as well as my contact information on this slide. As this is a recorded webinar, there's not a lot of opportunity for question and answer today, but please do feel free to reach out. Certainly happy to either answer questions or have a discussion by email or set up other opportunities to chat further about supply chain or collaboration or what the next steps could be. So thank you again. I really appreciate the time, and I hope the rest of the conference is successful. Cheers.
Thanks for Mr. Matt's very informative presentation on the details of the offshore wind supply chain. Following Mr. Matt, we will explore Scotland's offshore wind revolution, lessons and best practice for Australia, presented by Dr. April Kelly, country head and involved investment leader for the Australia and New Zealand and the Scottish Development International. Hi, April. The floor is over for you.
Thank you, Kayla. I'm just going to share my screen.
Hi, April. I can't hear your voice.
Can you hear me now? I'm just about to share my screen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm just going to share my screen. I've got, okay, I'm going to try this. So is that working now?
Yes.
Right, so thanks to Astrid for already acknowledging the Wurundjeri people where I am. I'm based in Melbourne also, and thanks for the invitation to talk. It's been over 10 years since the world's first 30 megawatt deep water floating wind farm, Hywind, was developed in Scotland, and the developments have accelerated since then. And in this picture, you'll see this is a part of the 50 megawatt Kincardine offshore wind farm. And this is the largest floating wind array in the world, and it was developed by Scottish company Flotation Energy, now part of the TEPCO group. And it's just one of the examples of investors expanding Scotland's offshore wind capability by participating through projects or investment, or the finance that they bring. There are lots of factors that are driving Scotland's offshore wind industry forward, and I'll talk you through a few of these. But first, I wanted to say a little bit about Scottish Development International. Has that slide changed? Because I've got, as I said, two screens, and it's not clear to me which one you're seeing. But hopefully it's SDI screen now. So we're the specialist trade, capital investment and inward investment arm of Scotland's economic development agencies. And our purpose really is to grow Scotland's exports, secure capital investment, and to bring transformational inward investment into Scotland. And we're an international organisation, so we've got multiple locations across the world. We're in 23 countries, and we've got a team here in Australia, of course. And we're really focused on what we're doing, especially on climate change. And we're taking a really values-led approach on this. And what I mean by that is that we do, as a government agency, everything is informed by a mission to be progressive, inclusive, and a sustainable country that prioritises collective well-being. So that's at the heart of our operating principles. And becoming a net zero nation by 2045 is a core mission. So on the right-hand side, that's a snapshot of how we're going to achieve this. And right now, we're generating enough renewable electricity to meet domestic demand in Scotland. And at the same time, of course, we need to decarbonise our total energy demand. So we're focusing on transport, heat, and industrial sectors and sites across Scotland. We aim to have 50% of Scotland's total energy demand met by renewables by 2030. And to achieve our target of net zero by 2045, we of course need to increase generation of renewable energy. And clean hydrogen particularly is going to be a really important energy vector in areas of our economy that are difficult to electrify. And using offshore wind to generate these green electrons for this is a really key part of our plan. Scotland's in the global top 10 offshore wind markets and already generates 40% of the UK's capacity. So here's what that offshore wind looks like. And really this is, it's a capacity over time. It's a very busy slide. These slides will be available afterwards. But really what you're seeing here is operational projects stacked on the left, and these are in green. And then they're phased development across that time frame, with capacity increasing, of course, over time. The yellow dates, it's really important to note, are subject to grid connection and planning consent. And there are some projects that we don't have dates for, so these aren't appearing on that timeline. And a more comprehensive picture we can see on a geographical basis. So this is the full pipeline of offshore wind projects in Scotland. It's a really busy slide, and I'll break it down into 3 different areas over 3 slides. But first, if you look on the left, we can see that all these coloured shapes represent all of the offshore wind projects, operational and planned. So the existing pipeline, that's represented by the first 4 coloured categories, and that's about 10 gigawatts. Then we've got 2 recent leasing rounds called ScotWind and INTOG. And here's the interesting thing. All that green that you're seeing, that's all floating offshore wind in the pipeline. Over time, we also wanted to give people a way to get in really quickly to this offshore wind activity into the supply chain. So this is where INTOG comes in, and that's the purple. This was a leasing round for offshore wind projects that would be connected directly to oil and gas infrastructure. And all of these are floating offshore wind. In aggregate, in this whole picture across the total pipeline, this gets us up to more than 50 gigawatts by 2035. And this is as much as Europe has operational for offshore wind, and it's what US has planned. Matt talked us through an extension of that. I'm going to walk you through the existing pipeline now. So this, you can see in this diagram, about 3 gigawatts is operational, so that's in red, and then there's also 3 gigawatts of consented projects, and that also includes the construction stage, so that's the orange and yellow here, and a further 4 gigawatts in the pipeline, which is the blue. Scotland needs to move from an industry that's built approximately 3 gigawatts of operational offshore wind in the past 15 years to one that can build over 30 gigawatts over the next 15 years. Scotland's first offshore wind farm, Ruban Rig, and the top of this list, was commissioned in 2010. And it's been over 10 years since we developed Hywind, second in the list. We've got 2 of the largest fixed offshore wind projects in the world, both now fully commissioned. One is the 1 gigawatt Seagreen project, and that's off the Angus coast, which became operational in October last year. And then, of course, the 950 megawatt Moray East project off the northeast coast, commissioned in April last year. And the 50 megawatt Kincardine offshore wind farm, which you saw on the first slide, and it's located off the Aberdeenshire coast and will generate enough green electrons to power about 50,000 Scottish households. One point to make here is how the UK government contracts for difference has enabled acceleration of low carbon electricity generation in the UK. So you'll probably know that CFDs are designed to de-risk investment in low carbon electricity generation and provide price certainty for generators who apply for an auction price or that strike price. Successful bidders in the UK then enter into a contract on that strike price with the government-owned low carbon contracts company. You'll have heard possibly that round 5 last year was not a good one for offshore wind. There were no offshore wind participants in the auction, and the signal was heard loud and clear by the UK government. And within a month of that round closing last year, the UK government announced an increase, which was the issue, in administrative strike price by 66%. Floating offshore wind price will rise 52%. So round 6 will open next month, and we do expect to see many more offshore wind projects, of course, in that round. So ScotWind is the really large leasing round that we've got shown in this slide. So this is really overlaid with the operational assets, offshore wind assets. So ScotWind is all of the green and the dark blue. For all of these ScotWind projects, they're not in planning anymore. All the leasing rounds are finished and all the developers are assigned. We're now in commercial phase for all of these projects listed. And ScotWind exceeded all capacity expectations with 30 gigawatts spread over these 19 projects listed here. And it's easy to see on this map that Scotland is one of the most active regions globally and certainly one of the largest commercial scale offshore wind efforts. So what do these colours in the table mean? Dark blue is the fixed offshore wind, and the green, as I said before, the green is the transformational thing for Scotland. It represents about 19 gigawatts of floating offshore wind in the pipeline. And the scale of these floating wind projects for ScotWind will make Scotland the largest market in the world, one of the largest markets in the world for this emerging tech, and offers the potential for a really large proportion of the components for these wind farms to be manufactured in Scotland. So now ScotWind is where developers are really focused, and especially on driving local supply chain capacity. And one thing to note here is that ScotWind applicants were required to submit supply chain development statements. So these basically outlined the nature and the location of all their supply chain activity, which gave us some really important indicators for capacity. I'll come back to this in a couple of slides. So as we considered what was needed to deliver ScotWind, we realised that we needed a route for really supercharging this supply chain. So we leveraged an important part of Scotland's economy, oil and gas. Of course, we're in an energy transition globally, but we still have significant oil and gas assets in Scotland. So we asked, can we decarbonise the process? Now we're looking at electrifying the North Sea basin, and that's called INTOG, and gives Scotland an extra 5 gigawatts of renewable capacity itself. It also means that the supply chain can activate really, really quickly, because this INTOG pipeline will actually move quite quickly. And then that supply chain capability and expertise then bleeds into that larger, longer term ScotWind projects and allows us to ramp this up even further. So this is what INTOG looks like. And there's two sets of projects. It's about 5.5 gigawatts, all floating wind. And this process allowed developers to apply for seabed rights to develop offshore wind projects that do one of two things. A set of projects consist of small-scale, innovative projects of about 100 megawatts or less. This is the in part of INTOG. So 5 projects were successful there and set to generate about 450 megawatts of capacity. The second set of projects will reduce emissions from the North Sea oil and gas sector by supplying renewable electricity to this infrastructure, the TOG element. 8 projects are set to generate about 5 gigawatts of capacity there. 12 projects are listed on the right, and they've now all secured exclusivity agreements. And development work will start while Marine Scotland are planning proceeds for site approvals, and option agreements are expected this year. And this is going to move quickly and drive innovation in the supply chain and hopefully bring new market entrants into the supply chain. So what are the key things that Scotland's been looking at? This next slide gives you a sense of some of the areas that we're looking at. We currently don't have a manufacturing supply chain scaled to what's needed to deliver 40 gigawatts of offshore wind. The image on the left is Hywind. Scotland's done a lot of innovating in the 10 years since then, and that continues with ScotWind. So the big questions now are how to develop this sector at the pace and the scale that's required. So we're looking closely at the supply chain, doing gap analysis, capability analysis, and crucially demand analysis, which was one of the points that Matt was making, and using these results to direct what we need in Scotland. So on the second point, a build-out campaign of this scale requires really careful coordination between developers in terms of data sharing, supply chain investment, use of facilities and build-out facilities, and scheduling. A collaborative framework has been implemented, and I will reference that later. And on this third point, investment in strategic infrastructure and the supply chain facilities is going to be required several years in advance of the actual build-out of ScotWind, and before firms can actually place orders. So nothing can move until final investment decision, of course, which itself relies on the CFD process. So investment confidence is really key. And on the next point, risk. If a supply chain company needs to make decisions about new infrastructure, new facility, port capacity, they need to do this at relatively high risk. And also the drive for cost reduction has resulted in thin margins, and the risk gets pushed down the supply chain, which can make offshore wind supply chain contracts pretty unattractive compared with sectors like oil and gas. And competition is fierce, of course, in offshore wind globally. Well-established supply chains can move really swiftly to capitalise on the opportunities in Scotland. And Matt made this point around that pressure on supply chains globally. The two graphs on the right illustrate the point about limited port space. So the left graph represents the technical demand on port space for offshore wind floating, fixed, and both, 3 line charts over time. And the graph on the right represents the port utilisation and surface areas required year on year. And that basically just the take-home message is that the demand peaks in both graphs overlay in 2029. And this analysis was done by Scotland's Offshore Wind Energy Council. And it clearly shows that there's a shared sector risk of slowed deployment due to shortage of port space for assembly and manufacture. So we can't, at the moment, support a build-out campaign of the scale of ScotWind and INTOG without additional investment and coordination between developers, between investors, and a supportive public sector. So we're really focusing on 3 key areas. Well, we're focusing on all of them, but what I'm going to do is walk you through those 3 areas, just as an example of how we're looking at it. So on this next slide, on the right, is a photo of NIG Energy Park on the Cromarty Firth. So it's now, this is actually now a location of one of 2 of Scotland's green free ports, where companies based there will benefit from tax reliefs, simplified customs, and streamlined planning, and I'll touch on that later. So this table, it's a lot there, but it basically represents mapping data from the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, which looked at established wind farms, and found that the Scottish supply chain had secured over 3/4 of the operations and maintenance work. So this is in purple here on that pretty much the second last or third last line. And which represents about 28% of the total cost of a wind farm over that 25 to 30-year lifespan. And in contrast, component fabrication has a really small Scottish supply chain element. So we looked at this in more detail in the next slide. And we're looking at these supply chain commitments in particular from the latest ScotWind applications. Crown Estate Scotland required developers to spend on average £1.5 billion for each of the projects on the supply chain in Scotland. So this gave us a really good idea of what that future looked like and the progress we're making towards a more mature offshore wind industry, and crucially, where we need to focus for that component manufacture piece. The table breaks down the spend commitment to Scotland and elsewhere, so that's the rows, and then across project phases, that's the columns. And the bar graph shows committed spend in Scotland only. So with manufacturing, the largest committed spend. So when we look at this manufacturing for floating offshore wind, with capability and demand analysis, we identified a number of areas to focus on. So this is summarising a huge amount of work, of course. Substructures, mooring and anchor systems, export cables. And focusing on these helps us build Scotland's position as a world leader in deploying floating offshore wind. So those focus areas, taking really sort of galloping through those, we looked at demand for the floating substructure in Scotland, which is over 1,300 structures by 2032. So these are so Scotland's already home to companies capable of fabricating substructure components, but at the moment there's no single company looking at serial substructure fabrication or assembly. So there's an opportunity to establish this manufacturing capability in Scotland. And the pipeline of commercial scale projects, which you've seen in the previous slides in Scotland, will also bring economies of scale with cost reductions through next generation manufacturing, standardization, robotic welding. And we're in discussions with companies who can bring those capabilities into Scotland. So mooring and anchoring, accelerating these types of floating wind tech is really important, and a particular focus of Scotland's Floating Offshore Wind Centre of Excellence. And most of you will be better acquainted with the details of these multiple components in mooring systems than I am. But the point of this slide really is that we're looking to work with partners who can offer design innovation and materials innovations that will drive cost reductions. For example, the photo on the top right here is a drag embedment anchor. It's manufactured by a Scottish company called Bruce Anchor. And these guys have successfully diversified from the oil and gas industry into offshore renewables. And they're developing a drag embedded anchor specifically for floating offshore wind, which will provide the same holding capacity as bigger units, but at a much reduced weight, so a fraction of the transportation costs. You can see the scale of the opportunity below the photo from the numbers, and the timeframes are really tight for this. So we're not just working with existing supply chain companies in Scotland, but of course looking to transform things with international companies coming into Scotland. So just looking at the cable opportunity, floating offshore wind requires high capacity subsea cable systems to collect and export the power. New innovation is needed to address cable design challenges, provide higher voltage array cables for higher rated turbines, which are higher rated year by year. And substations in particular haven't been needed so far for the limited power levels of demo projects. They were just delivered directly to shore. But now moving to commercial scale projects, these have significantly higher power outputs and require these offshore substations. So it's going to take time to grow that local supply chain to deliver all these solutions. And as I've said before, some capabilities are going to come with international companies. And a recent example of this is Sumitomo Electric from Japan, committing to set up power cable manufacture in Scotland. One of the other areas I did make reference to is this developer coordination piece, and of course the port assembly, which is really intimately connected to that. And again, you can see Hywind here, which is just this isolated project. But we're talking about a leasing round as big as ScotWind, 30 gigawatts. It's a massive undertaking, and collaboration and coordination across developers, government, port infrastructure partners is going to be absolutely key. It's not an easy task, but it's a really, really critical one. And there's no question that upgrades to Scottish ports are needed. With 70% of operations and maintenance spend committed to Scotland, which we've already seen, this will trigger a surge in activity in these ports. And Scottish ports will require pre-investment before all of this work happens. And the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, which is the icon, the logo that I've popped in this slide, they're playing a really leading role in this coordination piece. So just really quickly, this gives you a sense, the next slide gives you a sense of the port infrastructure, the scale and coordination required. So this is port harbour infrastructure plus the actual offshore wind projects. For all of these projects, developers will be making use of port space for marshalling, final assembly of foundations and turbine components during the build out, and of course the ports needed in the construction phase. And during the ops phase, the ports will support O&M, and the ports are needed for disassembly, of course. So many of these ports have already got plans and are already expanding. But again, this coordination piece is really key as that happens, and ideally before it happens. So this slide this is really describing the SOEC partnership. So this Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council partnership. It's a partnership between Scottish public sector and the offshore wind industry, ultimately. And there's multiple work streams that SOEC is focused on, which are listed here. But it's the work this group is doing with developers that I want to really focus on. SOEC has worked with developers and created a group to collaborate on supply chain development. And each developer has made supply chain commitments, which I've mentioned it previously. So a large group of these developers, about 19, have come together to agree how to direct that money that they have put on the table to drive this supply chain development as a nation for this sort of sovereign capability. And this is called the strategic investment model on the right. Companies looking to invest in Scotland make a proposal into SIM and then look at funding by these developers. So SIM then looks at funding by these developers, and then the developers make a decision on that funding. And this collaboration is across a combined capacity of 30 gigawatts. And the priority now for this group is to agree investment for large infrastructure and manufacturing projects that will help build ScotWind. There's 38 projects that were selected last month have completed stage 1. And these have a combined total capital expenditure of around £6.5 billion. And 3 of these projects were selected last month for stage 2 with a combined value of £500 million. Scottish Government have also announced that £500 million over 5 years will be available to help developers of the offshore wind sector. And the details of that are yet to come in terms of the mechanisms of that, but already £67 million has been announced for 24-25. Really briefly, I'm not going to say anything more to this slide, only to say that, as I said, there's 2 green free ports in Scotland, and these will provide tax benefits and customs benefits, but also streamlined planning, which will be absolutely key. So more information in the link there when you get these slides. And this is a snapshot of what's happening in Scotland. Essentially, it's really fast growing. This offshore wind industry, of course, some already saying that it's going to be bigger for Scotland than oil and gas. And for something growing at this pace and this scale, a lot of support's needed to bring it together. And these are examples of the coordinating mechanisms that existed for a long time and have sort of transitioned some of these from the oil and gas sector into something that is around offshore wind. And this is just it's not a definitive list, it's just an idea of some of them. SOEC, you can see in the first column, that coordinating role I've talked through. And an organisation in the second column called Deep Wind is a cluster that brings 700 members together. And it's the largest cluster of its kind in Europe. There's lots of working groups specialising in technology areas and deep water. And if you want to know the voice of the industry in Scotland, Scottish Renewables is where you go. And it's worth having a look at, any number of these when you get the slides. It's worth saying a bit about skills too. Many of these organisations that listed on the previous slide are looking at long-term need for skilled workers, what training is required, looking at the diversification of the oil and gas sector. Complex subsea skills can transfer into offshore wind, and there's dedicated work streams by SOEC. Scotland has a skills agency. There's 50,000 highly skilled people working in Scotland's low carbon sector, more than 100,000 people with transferable skills in oil and gas, and 20,000 graduates a year are coming out of Scotland's universities in engineering and tech. So we just need to make sure these skills are deployed in the right areas. So there's lots of work to do, but the levers are in place. Thanks, Kayla, back to you.
Thanks, April. Many thanks for your very detailed information. And actually, we will have one question for you. You can see from our Q&A box. The question for you is, on the national energy grid. So from your perspective, what steps will Australia take, including both the development of its grid infrastructure and the management of existing infrastructure to ensure that wind projects are designed and developed and delivered on time?
Yeah, I think the grid infrastructure is a huge one. So a really coordinated approach to that grid infrastructure in Australia is required. In the UK. As a comparator, I've got the national grid, and to be honest, there really does need to be an upgrade in a lot of that grid infrastructure in the UK, and similar situation to Australia, to ensure that the delays experienced or just the timescales aren't impacted too much by waiting for grid connections. Already we know that, National Grid announced last year £10 billion worth of additional grid funding for upgrade to the north of Scotland. But we know that the National Grid have said that over the next 7 years, 5 times the amount of build of transmission lines is required than was built in the last 3 decades. So we understand in the UK that there's an enormous job to do on that grid infrastructure, and I think Australia similarly needs to understand as a collaborative across all of the projects in Australia, across federal and state, where the grid infrastructure needs to happen and how we can coordinate the funding of that to ensure that Scotland as a nation then achieves that offshore wind capability or wind capability.
Yeah, April, thanks for your very informative sharing and generous answer to the questions. Thank you. And now it's time to delve into our final topic for today's session. First, I want to introduce Mr. Jack Brompton, who is a partner at the DLA Piper, will guide our panelists and explore cultivating resilient supply chains for Australia's booming wind industry. Hi, Jack. I will give you the floor to introduce our panel members.
Sure. Thanks, Kayla. And thanks all for the very interesting discussion today. I'd just like to also acknowledge traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting or living, working today. I'm based in Brisbane, the land of the Yagara Turrbal people. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and traditional owners all over Australia. My name's Jack Brumpton. I'm a partner in the projects team at DLA Piper, based in Brisbane. I work across energy and natural resources projects in Australia and across the Asia Pacific, recently doing a number of work streams in the Australian offshore wind industry. And it is a really exciting sector at the moment. We've heard today from speakers more generally about the wind industry in Australia. We've also heard about the wind industry and development of supply chains in the US, and just then in Scotland. And that's all been fascinating. We're on our own journey here, I guess, of scaling up the offshore wind industry. There's so much happening right now. Obviously, two areas have been declared and license applications submitted in those areas in Gippsland and the Hunter. Victoria's taking the lead and has made it targets for offshore wind public, with the 9 gigawatts by 2040 target and 2 gigawatts to be built by 2032. And there's so much excitement about in the sector, but at the same time, in this post-COVID era of rising interest rates and increasing project costs, I guess there's also an element of realism creeping in about the challenges for the industry, and those are becoming imminent now with the first feasibility licenses for Gippsland just hopefully around the corner. So chief among the issues is that supply chain and project costs issue. And I'm joined today by three panelists who are experts really in various elements of the offshore wind industry and the supply chain. Bodhi Darville, Ms. Bodhi Darville is at the Latrobe Valley Authority. I might let you just introduce yourself briefly, Bodhi.
Thanks, Jack. I'm joining from Gunai-Kurnai country here in Latrobe Valley in Gippsland today. Just really briefly, the LVA was set up in 2016 in response to the Hazelwood mine closure, and our role now as a part of the Department of Jobs, Skills, Industries and Regions, the Victorian State Government, is to support the entire Gippsland region through transition, not just in closure of coal, oil and gas, also forestry, agriculture and a range of other areas.
Thanks, Bodhi. Ashley, I might turn to you to introduce yourself now.
Yeah, hi everyone. Ashley McDonald from Direct Infrastructure. I'm joining from Newcastle, the home of the Awabakal and Wanamai peoples. I'm with Direct Infrastructure. We're a small Australian renewable energy developer with a focus on offshore wind. We're partnered in Gippsland with 3 other companies, including AGL Energy. I've been in the marine space for over 30 years. I've worked in 8 ports around Australia and New Zealand and visited over 100 ports around the world in my work as a marine professional.
Thanks, Ashley. And finally, Kimberly.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kimberly Cram, co-founder of KIMAenergy. My background is in offshore wind development, which I've done for like 14 years now. Infrastructure and energy prior to that. Been a developer in the UK with Yola, and then in Taiwan with Macquarie, where I was based from the early days of the industry in 2017. Now based in Melbourne with my own business, which I've co-founded with Maya Malik, where we focus on advisory and early stage development across the APAC offshore wind market. Great to see everyone. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Kimberly. I might start with you for the first question, if that's all right. And it's about what I've heard described as a chicken and egg problem of the offshore wind projects being expensive because we lack a robust local supply chain. But at the same time, suppliers and manufacturers aren't able to really commit the investments necessary in manufacturing and in supply chain because of the lack of certainty about whether there's going to be enough demand. So I guess the first question is around the targets for offshore wind, and I alluded to that in my introduction. In Victoria, there's still no target at the Commonwealth level, but what effect do you think government targets have on incentivising supply chain? And other than those sort of symbolic or signalling targets, what other steps have you seen governments take that works for incentivising supply chains?
Yeah, I think given where we are in this kind of very early journey with offshore wind in Australia, my experience has been that targets are hugely important setting up the industry. And that's been the case in established and emerging markets. They're really there to give the signal to the market that there is a credible, viable need for offshore wind and that it will be supported by that robust framework. And that's all really about giving confidence for investment. And given where we are in Australia, we're at such an early stage of trying to develop and create that confidence around the market. So I think it's kind of worth just reflecting for a few minutes on where we are and what I kind of think might be helpful in that kind of offshore wind journey here. And it does really come down to those targets. So, at least we have some confidence now that's grown over the last kind of 18, 24 months that there is now a commitment to renewable energy. Federal level set that 82% target by 2030. And I think it's a great sign that we already are very clear that we've got 6 areas for offshore wind. And it's great that Victoria has taken that lead at a state level with its 9 gigawatts targets. So I think there's some very good signals here that are happening already with the Victoria and with the New South Wales processes for offshore wind. But my own feeling is that those kind of ambitions are still very state focused at this point. And having just one state is not really enough to attract a market, particularly given that global rollout of offshore wind. And beyond that Victoria target, I think there's really limited clarity on just how offshore wind fits into that overall 82% target. I think for me, it would be fantastic to see that kind of federal level planning on what generation is actually needed and what's coming offline. How does offshore wind fit into that? Set that very clear expectation on how the energy mix is being designed. And that hasn't happened yet. And I think if we can focus on that, as well as looking at those national targets, that will really help set that kind of credible target. And particularly, I think for offshore wind, if we're going into that next level, having targets specifically around both fixed and floating technology, separating those and that overall target is really important, particularly given how we have a different state of readiness, particularly for floating. So yeah, I think we're off to a good start. But if you look at other markets, when you've got those very clear specific targets, it really drives the market. If you look at the UK and Germany, they've got 30 gigawatts planned for 2030. Taiwan set out with 5.7 gigawatts by 2025, 50 gigawatts by 2035. And when you have those signals, the market really moves very quickly. And we see that really drives developers into the market, which then brings the supply chain and lenders. So my preference is that we really focus on that top level, get those national targets. But also, I think there's quite a few other areas that we should focus on, some of which April mentioned in her sessions. Looking at the UK, for example, we started projects with no localization. When we moved to CFD, there were some soft targets around supporting the supply chain. But government was quite heavily involved in providing tax incentives, subsidies, investment being available to really grow the supply chain. And I think it's important that that burden is taken off individual developers and that there's a more coordinated level led by government. So I think if we can start looking at those sorts of clear policy signals, maybe have a target of say 20 to 30 gigawatts by 2040, and being very clear on the frequency of projects being awarded, so there's a continuous rollout, making it very clear on things like route to market, grid readiness, harbours. With all of that, coupled with looking at what the supply chain here is capable of, really mapping out those capabilities, what could work for domestic supply, but also potentially for export. I think if you can kind of shape that framework, and I feel that there's the ability to really shape policy here, I think if we can get that framework right, then developers come and naturally that brings the supply chain and lenders. So yeah, we're off to a good start, but there's definitely some steps that I think we can borrow from others and really kind of just how successful this could be here.
All right. Ashley, turning to you highlighted in your introduction just your background in ports and the fact that you've worked in so many over the years and visited so many. I've heard offshore wind described as much as an offshore renewable energy industry as it is a maritime logistics industry, what with the requirements around berth space, laydown areas and so on. I've got a two-parter for you here around that. One, how ready do you think our ports are to service an offshore wind industry and what it's going to take in terms of level of port capacity required? And number two, because I'm pretty sure that you're going to say that we're not at already, where do the necessary capital and incentives come from to tool up our ports and the maritime logistics capacity, do you think?
Yeah, good. Thanks. I'll keep it brief. Yeah, as you said, look, we're not ready for offshore wind in Australia in terms of port capacity yet, but that needs to be understood in the context that our ports are busy, which is great. There's a high level of utilisation of current existing trades. So berth availability is probably the single biggest issue in terms of offshore wind. And then you've got, of course, the amount of laydown that's available that's at a suitable load rating and is available to be used for offshore wind. So there is significant capacity investment required around Australia. There isn't actually a single port that could do it at the moment, but there are opportunities out there to do a trade swap. For example, there might be a port that's not suitable for offshore wind, but it could absorb another trade, and offshore wind could take its place in another port closer to the site. Traditionally in Australia and elsewhere, ports have been run by port authorities through the public sector. 20, 30 years ago, that was the main way ports were driven. Productivity was fairly low and returns were limited. And privatisation has seen port authorities act more like landlords. And so the port terminals business has become a very attractive asset base for investment banks, sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. But there's risks that those investors like to control when they're looking at a port terminal investment. And as Kimberly has said, and April has said also very, very well, that we need to de-risk the investment for investors in infrastructure and manufacturing that will enable the supply chain for offshore wind. And ports are no different. So there's financial risk, there's market risk, there's regulatory risks, there's specialisation risk. So if you upgrade a port to suit offshore wind, is it future-proof for other needs that might be existing 15, 20 years from now? If we build out offshore wind for a decade, what's the business case that supports the second 20 years or 10 years of that to pay back that investment? So we're talking about potentially $1 billion investment in a port. You might see 10 years of business from offshore wind. What do you see past that? And so these signals, as Kimberly has said, and the transparency that April talked about through the Scottish model provide the confidence for investment and underwrite those business cases for. So we'll get there, absolutely. The good thing about Australian ports is, although we don't currently have the capacity to marshal offshore wind, there is incredible land holdings around some of the Australian ports in the regions where offshore wind is proposed to be developed, and that's very promising. So there is a lot of land that can be used to develop for offshore wind.
That's good news. Okay. Bodhi, turning to you finally, it was interesting in Matt Shields' sort of recorded presentation there from the US, he talked about energy justice issues being key to all of this. And I wanted to talk to you, I guess, around that and the fact that supply chain is not so much just infrastructure, vessels and equipment, but it's also people and communities. So could you talk to us about the journey that Gippsland's been on with obviously the history of traditional industry there and transitioning those skills and the supply chain and workforce requirements across to new energy? Tell us about some of the highlights of the work that's being done there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Gippsland, like some of the other heavy industrial regions that is transitioning across Australia and also internationally, one of the important things to recognise is how much skill and capability there is in our industrial region that is transitioning. So we've generated, I think, 80% of the state's power for the past 100 years, and we produce also 70% of the state's gas, as well as significant export. So with that comes a whole range of skills in power generation, but also a whole range of skills in engineering, design, offshore marine capabilities, particularly in oil and gas, electrical fabrication. So there are some really significant industries that are already established here and some really significant skills. So I think that the question of transition and just transition is a really interesting one, because there is an element of it that's very well connected to social license and to community support and to communities coming on that journey. And there's also a question that is very economically driven and just makes sense in terms of picking up those existing businesses, picking up those existing skills and repurposing them within the region rather than needing to import them from somewhere else and all of the things that come with importing a workforce and establishing new businesses. So there's a whole range of work that's being done in Gippsland, both by all levels of government, particularly local government and state, but also significantly by industrial players, including the power stations themselves. Yallourn Energy Australia is doing some really important work at the moment. Our educational sector is very active in looking at skills pathways and training opportunities. Our traditional owner body, GLAWAC, is also very active in looking at opportunities for partnering on development and for benefits from development. So there are a whole range of different projects that are being activated to enable the region to take advantage of this transition and come out of it with more benefit than we entered it, but also to really take advantage of all of the skills and capabilities that exist here and make sure that those are a part of the transition and are actively contributing to it.
Thanks, Brodie. That's great, and I love hearing about those stories of the region there and how this industry can benefit the regions. It's such an important topic. Kimberly, I wanted to come back to you on the topic of sort of lessons learned from overseas, and we heard quite a good presentation before about Scotland and everything that is happening over there. We heard about the US as well. You have experience from the UK and leading in on developments there, but also relevantly recently you were in Taiwan and led sort of the development of the industry there, really, and for which you were awarded an MBE. So you have the expertise from that jurisdiction, which is obviously so relevant to us here in the Southern Hemisphere. What did you see in Taiwan that was done really well that we can learn from here in terms of developing a supply chain? And what did you think perhaps could have been done better and that we could learn as a lesson here as we develop things in Australia?
Yeah, I think Taiwan is a really interesting one. I'm kind of been involved in all 3 rounds of award there, and when you see a market that has so much promise and it's attracted so many developers and the whole supply chain, it's actually really frustrating to see just what's happening there now. Definitely in a situation where local content and localization has had a really negative impact on the market. So I thought maybe just spend a couple of minutes just touching on Taiwan's journey and just what we can learn from that. So yeah, so as I mentioned, there's been kind of 3 rounds of offshore wind in Taiwan. They've been very clear on targets for offshore wind, but also how that fits into the wider energy mix. Historically, they've imported 97% of their fuel, so very keen to move from that and get energy security. And their energy policy has really attracted bipartisan support, which I think has been very important to really push it forward. So, you know, things were looking very promising with their targets. They set off with a very clear framework on project awards, looking at marine spatial planning, how you would get your rights to projects, coupling things like seabed exclusivity and grid connection together. So very promising, particularly over the initial rounds. But then came quite a significant shift around localization. Round 1, demonstration projects, small scale, no localization there. Round 2 started to see some direct award projects and then some from an auction which had increased localization. But really the big shift has came in with their round 3 projects. In terms of timing, round 2 projects were awarded mid-2018. Round 3, round 3.1, was awarded at the end of 2022. You already have an issue there that you have 4 years where no projects are being awarded. We actually saw quite a few developers and investors and the supply chain leave the market because they lacked that clarity on how projects would be rolled out. And then the big shift really came around policy and localization. I think a lot of people have probably heard of the examples from Taiwan, but policy shifted to become very prescribed on local content, very hard, very prescriptive on which components had to be sourced locally and to what percent. And you know, while it's very important to look at that ability to achieve industrialization and economic benefit, that hard push has actually had a very negative impact on how viable projects are, and particularly how attractive offshore wind is. So I think just kind of elaborating a little bit on that, main issues really been around foundation fabrication, where developers are required to source 60% of their supply from within Taiwan. And really, the supply chain for fabrication has been non-existent. It's really about building it up from scratch or looking to convert shipbuilding facilities, try and manage serial production. So it's been a very steep learning curve. That meant that not the most experienced, not the fastest, not the cheapest, not the best at health and safety, were basically guaranteed to be awarded major manufacturing contracts. So you can imagine, with no competition, what does that do? Simply forces up because you're guaranteed to secure that contract. And if you look back at kind of how pricing has evolved on foundations, in Europe at the time, you might pay, say, 5 to 7 million euro per jacket. In Taiwan, that was costing 20 million per jacket and more. And recently, prices have increased even more within the market. So if you're looking at a 1 gigawatt project, maybe say using a 15 megawatt turbine, it's over 60 locations, over 60 jackets. That's adding on over €1 billion to your project business case. And with the way the market is now, with the increased cost of debt, inflation, etc., no developer could absorb that cost increase. So projects are really at risk in Taiwan at the moment of not going ahead because of that impact. So for me, I think if developers are being forced to use local suppliers, then it should be much more of a cooperation with government. Those measures that I touched on earlier, where government supports the supply chain, really help, because otherwise a single project really is bearing a big burden of this. And in return, developers simply have to go out and find a way to cover that increased cost. And that has typically now come through increasing the price that they have to sell the power for. So either looking at greater subsidies or increasing price needed for offtake. So I think Taiwan has really put itself in quite a difficult position, forcing that kind of race to zero subsidy only 5 years after the industry has started. It's not an established market like, say, the UK. It's really now forced developers to seek higher power prices. And I think it's such a pity for offshore wind, where we've worked so hard, at least over those 14 years that I've been in offshore wind. The UK's had projects for 20 years now. It really is an industry focused on bringing down the cost of offshore wind. It has made it one of the lowest cost of forms of energy. But localization now is at risk of really jeopardizing that. And it has been the perfect storm in Taiwan that's really jeopardized and slowed down the rollout of offshore wind there. So I think for me, it's really looking at now what the alternatives are. We want to make sure that there are very much industrialization and local economic benefits, but it has to be done in a very considered way, particularly for a new industry. It doesn't simply put up the cost very dramatically and stop the industry before it gets started.
Yeah, and I noted with interest in the recent implementation statement that the Victorian government released, that they sort of made clear that they wouldn't be seeking to impose hard numbers around local content, at least initially. And I took that as a good sign for developers, that there'd be a sort of soft approach initially before perhaps transitioning to something a bit more hard later on the local content front. But Ashley, on again around the sort of ports and maritime side of things, you've worked in and around the sector for so long. What do you think is the strengths of the existing offshore industry, and how can they be leveraged for offshore wind? And I guess more specifically around vessels, obviously there's some really bespoke types of vessels needed for offshore wind, with the jack-up vessels and the heavy lift vessels and so on. What do you think is the likelihood that we can address that supply chain challenge in Australia, and what might be solutions to get those types of vessels to Australia to service the industry?
Yeah, good. So I guess, as you know, Australia's had offshore and gas industry offshore for decades, both in Gippsland and Western Australia. There are a lot of skills that are directly transferable, especially in the marine space, engineering, a lot of the subsea specializations. So Star of the South, together with Atlas Professionals, funded by the Victorian government, did some great work on what the skills transfer and overlap is between oil and gas and offshore wind. I recommend people check that out. It's a really good piece of work. So I won't expand on that, except to say, there are obvious strengths that we have already in regions where offshore wind is proposed in skills, in the area of skills and experience, which is great. When it comes to vessels, I think as Matt so well presented, the problem is going to be that you've got an enormous targets being set in the US and elsewhere around the world that are competing for the same tonnage in terms of installation vessels. And so it's going to be incredibly important that proponents are involved very, very early in de-risking their procurement process for installation, and so that takes into account the long lead times for manufacturing. So Yundanul, looking at sort of 3 years, their last vessel took from order until delivery. Van Oord ordered a new jackup vessel in 21 and was delivered. It'll be delivered sometime this year. So there's 3 or 4 years build from order for the vessels. Manufacturing capacity is limited, so there's only a few countries that are actually building installation vessels. And then the technological obsolescence is a big factor. So of course the turbine sizes are increasing at a rapid rate, and so there is an obsolescence of vessels that have just been delivered 5 years from now. And so new vessels are being committed up to 5 years out from build date. So some vessels delivering next year are already booked out to 2030. All that just points to the need for proponents to align their installation windows and programming early to look at the interface risk between the different work packages, whether it's foundations or turbines, and how those work packages will be deconflicted and so forth. And then questions about the Northern Hemisphere winter, our summer, the mob and demob costs of getting vessels down here. Victorian government is doing some great work around exploring with proponents what it might look like to underwrite the costs of mob and demob and how they might coordinate that. It does point to in terms of supply chain, does point, as Kimberly has so well said, from our own experience, to transparency. Coordination is really, really important to secure this sort of capacity. It's going to be critical for Australia to be able to compete and get that tonnage of vessels down to Australia. No, I don't think developers are going to achieve it unless there is a level of coordination. And I think the strategic investment model that Scotland has put in place around ports and supply chain is a good example of where that can, some of those risks can be mitigated by having transparency and coordination in a framework. I don't think it's going to happen. The efficiencies won't happen if we let the market do its thing.
And Bodhi, maybe one final question for you, and then I'd encourage the audience to ask questions as well. If you have any, please put them in the chat, and I'll put them to our panelists today. But Bodhi, I guess you're not the first region to go through this sort of transition. Have you looked at other regions, be it across Australia or globally, and look to them and the journeys that they have been on to inform your own journey in Gippsland, and tell us a little bit about that journey and where you're at and looking forward to the future, where you hope to be in 2035, for example, as I look behind you there.
Yeah, absolutely we have. And I'll give a local example and then a state one and then go a bit bigger. One of the things that's been learnt really well from the closure of the Hazelwood mine and power station in 2016, 2017, which is being adopted at the moment, was the need to have time to do planning, to transition the workforce, to work with the supply chain, and to enable everybody to reorient. So Hazelwood closed with 6 months' notice, and when it closed, it triggered a crisis response from government and significant economic and workforce challenges. The Yulon Power Station from Energy Australia is slated to close in 2028, and we've had multiple years worth of planning until now, and then multiple years to come. And that transition is being done in a much more staged, planned approach with a whole range of partners. There's for instance, a workforce transition project that's just been complete, which maps the roles between the coal-fired power generation workers and the offshore wind industry. That's Star of the South, TAFE, Federation Uni, and Energy Australia have been working on together. Which shows that there's 70% matching between those roles. So locally, we've learned the need to be planned, to be deliberate, and to be ready, and give ourselves a long lead time to make these things happen really smoothly. And we're seeing that with the future slated closures. I think across Victoria, Gippsland is probably one of the most ready and proactive renewable energy zones, just in terms of the leadership that the region is taking. Things like the New Energy Conference. We've got a supplier database that we're putting together at the moment to showcase the capabilities that our businesses have. We've got a social procurement framework, which is really looking at some of the benefits that can come from procurement from First Nations businesses and the like. We've got a whole range of entities with really strong local leadership, and we have a transition plan for the region as well. So I think in terms of learning with and from the rest of the state, we're taking a bit of a leadership role there, but also looking really keenly at everyone else's experience to understand what sort of pitfalls and what things we need to avoid. And very much bringing the community along with us, and the social license and the explaining what's happening and talking about what benefits are going to come is a very big part of that. We're also a part of the Industrial Regions Action Network, which CSIRO and Climate Kick have just established recently, which is industrial regions across Australia connecting and learning from and working with each other. And in some ways we're ahead, and in some ways we're behind. So we're very much not wanting to reinvent the wheel in what we're doing locally. And the Net Zero Economy Agency at a federal level is certainly a part of that as well. In terms of international experience, we draw on that in a range of ways, partly through the proponents and the developers who have quite good relationships in the Gippsland region and are working very closely with us on a range of working groups and forums and problem solving around how we specifically are going to stand up certain elements of offshore wind, but renewables more broadly here. And they often give us case studies and examples. Scotland certainly comes up quite a lot in conversation. And we've also been hosting a range of delegations from international, a lot of parliamentary, but also industry delegations, Vietnam, Germany, Brunei. We've got Southeast Asia delegation, including Indonesia, coming on Thursday. So that's a two-way learning experience as well, where we share the transition journey of this region, and we also certainly learn from other regions in turn. And one of the delegations recently let us know a very fun fact, which is we're not spending enough money. So if we would like to transition well, we need to be spending a lot more cash.
Very, very interesting, and that sort of reflects, I guess, a number of points today, doesn't it, from various speakers. I am seeing a message from Kayla just saying, giving a question from the registration site for Ashley. Ash, I wonder if you could respond fairly briefly to this. Where do you see opportunities to expand on existing fabrication and manufacturing capabilities in Australian ports to support the industry? Can you give a couple of maybe specific questions around that? And I'm guessing that maybe Newcastle is one of those places with the opportunities. But over to you.
Yeah, so Australia has some steel fabrication skill abilities which can be leveraged to supply offshore wind for offshore wind. The scale is a challenge. I mean, it's very hard to get your head around what it would mean to fabricate even 10% of what's coming in Australia. It would be an enormous task. But notwithstanding that, there are the skills and the know-how and the confidence from some companies in Australia to be able to fabricate at least a proportion of foundations for these projects. If you're talking about Australian steel, we need to make sure that the steel is able to be cut the right size and the right thickness, and so that counts out anything to do with the turbines themselves. It's more, or the towers. It's more about the foundations, and so for fixed bottom, there are opportunities there, especially in terms of jacket foundations. Jackets are very large. They can be up to 80 meters tall, maybe 40 meters wide. They can weigh a couple of thousand tons at the minimum, and so they're very bulky and difficult to transport. And because of that, there's obviously a lot of risk, a lot of cost in transporting them. It might make sense if we were to actually get up a supply chain for fabrication in Australia to do things like jackets, which are very, very large, which involve many hours of. If we can get robotic welding involved in, for example, because there's an awful lot of welding involved in making a jacket, for example. So that's one example in terms of primary steel. Secondary steel, there are plenty of opportunities for steel fabricators to get involved in that supply chain as well. Blasting and painting, there's plenty of hundreds of tasks and services to be provided in the secondary tier 2 level as well. But I think in terms of tier 1, potentially some of those foundation elements can be stood up. And as Matt pointed out, these things are big and heavy. They can only be done at the port. So it's got to be land that's available at the port to be able to do that fabrication. And there are ports in the regions of Australia where offshore wind's proposed, where there is land that could be used for that fabrication. So that's exciting, but it would take coordination, leadership and government. It would take transparency. It would take something like the SIM that Kelly talked about. April talked about, sorry.
I'm seeing a few more questions come through. Kayla, I'm mindful that it's sort of coming up to the finishing time of the webinar, but I can keep asking these if you think it's the right thing to do. Otherwise, I can wrap up. But Kayla, I guess I'll just check with you whether you'd like me to keep going with a few questions, noting that we started a bit late.
Yes, we hope you are willing to answer these questions from our audience.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, I've got a few here. Maybe Kimberly, I can ask this one of you. How do you think we can incentivize independent competing developers to collaborate on unlocking supply chain? And how do you see that working really when there's this sort of hyper competition, in particular at the initial stage for feasibility licenses? It's such an intense competitive process. Then at the same time, we're trying to incentivize these sort of disparate players to collaborate with each other. I mean, there's a few examples of that working with the RPS sort of surveying work, for example, but more generally in the industry, how have you seen that work, or how have you seen that fail?
Yeah, I think we're in quite an interesting period of time until we know kind of the formal outcome of the Gippsland process. And so naturally, just now, everyone is quite keeping their cards close to their chest, which is what happens in every market. Typically, once projects are announced and the developers are clear as to who's progressing, there's actually kind of quite a natural group of areas where you start to collaborate. And that will be looking at things like feedback on the CFD mechanism, looking at environmentally how you will coordinate on surveys for offshore environmental support. We've done quite a few of these sorts of areas in the likes of Taiwan, the UK. So there will be areas that are just natural to start collaborating on. I think when it comes to the supply chain, there will be some opportunity for that. But again, there will just be some reluctance until the outcome, the next stage, which is the CFD auction, because a large part of how successful you'll be in that auction is your pricing. What tariff do you need? And that tariff is very heavily dependent on the inputs you have around your CapEx in particular. So I'd say probably over the next kind of 18 months, you'll see some areas that are easier to collaborate on. Post CFD, I think there'll be much more focus on how we actually do that. I do think as an industry, it's really important to really look at the program for how we're developing projects, because what we don't want to happen is that everyone's awarded at the same time, everyone has the same rush for financial flows, and then to get to operations. And in that period, we all need the same port space. We're all looking at similar vessel suppliers, similar manufacturing, and naturally projects will be delayed. So I think having a clear picture on what's required by when, grid, for example, will play quite heavily into that timing of what's available. That will really map out the whole programme for Gippsland, which then will allow us to kind of have a better conversation on supply opportunities. Then once you add in these state targets, increasing into a national target, will develop, you'll have even more projects running at probably quite similar times. And then to try and compete against not just APAC, but globally other projects, there's going to have to be a real coordinated effort trying to track the supply chain, and coupled with a very long list of other areas we need to look at, like integration, skills transitions, education. There's quite a large piece, which I think is a kind of great time now to be able to try and map out, but a lot of coordination needed from developers and right across government to put that framework in place.
Yeah, it's such an interesting time for sure, and being based in Queensland and having worked in the energy industry here for a decade, the problem that this collaboration problem is a common one, and the example that's often cited is that of the CSG to LNG projects in Queensland, where they all ended up building their own export pipelines up to Gladstone and then built 3 LNG facilities next to each other, and that's just an example of sort of the inefficiencies that can occur, I guess, when there's an industry that's developing really quickly, and it's competitive, and they're incentivized to collaborate to a degree, but then at the end of the day, they have their own customers and their own commercial mandates. And I might just, if we have time, Kayla, just ask one final question to Bodhi, I guess, and it sort of comes down to something that Kimberly was just talking about in relation to project costs, and I guess the balance between local content and developing local supply chains versus keeping project costs at a level where the projects can actually get away and be made to happen. How do you think about that from your perspective in the regions, and obviously you have your desire to see as much local development as possible, but at the same time the projects need to occur. So I wonder, in your mind, how do you see that working, and how do you see that balance being struck?
Yeah, I think everyone's really realistic that there is absolutely no chance that the entire supply chain for offshore wind will be established on Australian soil, let alone in Victoria, let alone in Gippsland. So there's not, there's not some daydream that that's going to be a reality. But I think it's really important that if there is something that can be done locally, and locally being in the region that the project's delivered, it's really important. And what I would say is small choices make a really big difference. So I'm just going to give 2 brief examples. I was a part of a reference group for an offshore wind company recently, and a local fisher person was a part of that reference group and said, hey, we've seen these ships going offshore doing this feasibility work. A bunch of us are really annoyed that you haven't used us. Why didn't you come to us first? Why didn't you talk to us? Like, local people notice. They notice what's happening. They notice that they're not being connected to. And the developer was able to explain that in this instance, because of technical requirements, there were certain things they required the vessel to be able to do that the local fleet couldn't achieve. And they were quite happy with that. But because there wasn't the explanation there, because there wasn't the relationship and the conversation to say, yes, we will prioritise using local vessels where possible, but here's what our scope of works looks like and why, or here's your opportunity to tender against these future requirements. There was that little breaking of trust, that little resistance. And I think when you get a lot of those, it really can build up to rejection of projects, to delays, to even court battles like we're seeing in other parts of the state. And I would say that, we've been talking about the really large elements of supply chain, giant steel works, turbine blades. We know they need to be imported internationally. There are a whole range of small things that can be done, even in these feasibility stages, which some of the developers are doing. Hiring local people for engagement and consultancy work, buying your workwear locally, doing your branding campaigns using local entities. There are a whole range of really small, really possible elements of any project that can absolutely be procured in the region that they're being delivered. And I guess I would really encourage people to look at all and any opportunities, not just the really large scale elements of supply chain procurement. Because it really does make a difference to local jobs, to local economy, local business opportunities, and therefore to how embedded the project is in the region and what its social license is.
Thanks, Bodhi, and that's such a good message to end on, I think. So I might just now say thank you to all of you, Bodhi Darville, Ashley McDonald and Kimberly Cram, MBE, for your time today. It's been a great panel. Thank you for taking the questions and the questions of our audience. And back to you, Kayla, to close.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks for Jack hosting this excellent panel discussion, and I also appreciate the valuable contributions from our distinguished panel members, Buddy, Kimberly, and Ashley. The panel is full of information and brings more thoughts on the opportunities and the challenges within the Australian wind supply chain. And how time flies now comes to the end of our webinar. I want once again and sincerely appreciate all the speakers today for preparing these speeches in your busy schedules. And also thanks for accompanying of our audience. Today's recording, along with a short recap, will be sent to all registrants next Friday. If possible, If there are any comments, please feel free to drop me a message at our below contact. Furthermore, I would like to remind you that this webinar serves as a virtual preview of our physical event, Australia Wind Energy 2024. This event is scheduled to be held from July 9th to 11th in Melbourne. We encourage you to secure your tickets and be a part of this remarkable event. We eagerly anticipate the opportunity to meet you in person and engage in a fruitful discussions. This is all for today's webinar. See you next time. Bye. Thanks again for your participation. Bye, Jack. Bye, Ashley.
Thank you.
Bye, April.